Welcome, everyone. My name is Susan Hackley. I'm the Managing Director of the Program on Negotiation here at Harvard Law School, a consortium program of Harvard, MIT, and Tufts. We're thrilled to have you here today for this discussion on an issue that could not be more relevant. PON has a lot of great events, and we have sign-up sheets here that will put you on our list to hear about our other events, so sign that if you want to. And after our speaker delivers his remarks, we're going to have Q&A, and when that happens, would you please turn on the little microphone button here and hold it, and then also say your name and where you're from. This is being filmed, and we will have it or parts of it up on our website eventually. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, William Ury. Bill Ury is a founder of the Program on Negotiation. And way back when he was a PhD student here at Harvard in social anthropology, he wrote a book with Roger Fisher and Bruce Patton called Getting to Yes. That book has sold 15 million copies, so bravo. And Bill has gone on to have an amazing career as a quiet and brilliant negotiation advisor and mediator. He's written other books, notably Getting Past No and Getting to Yes with Yourself, both wonderful books to read and enjoy. And he founded something called the Abraham Path, a cultural walking trail through the Middle East that goes through several countries and is a way to think about the shared culture in the Middle East that all the descendants of Abraham have. Most recently this fall, we had a big event at PON honoring President Juan Manuel Santos of Colombia for the peace agreement there after decades of violent conflict. And Bill Ury was a senior advisor to President Santos in those negotiations that helped bring about this wonderful peace agreement. We're so happy to have you here today.
It's an enormous pleasure to be back, see so many friends and colleagues, and to talk about what I want to talk with you about today. In fact, discuss, I'd like this to be as collaborative, a collaborative inquiry into this question of whether or not the United States can get to yes with North Korea. In other words, reach some kind of mutually acceptable agreement short of going to war, which would be catastrophic. And it's called often, I saw it's called topic number one in Washington. It's really topic number one in the world in some sense. And I'd like to just begin, if I may, by telling a story that some of you, maybe many of you have heard me tell before, but just to kind of set the tone for this, which comes as, thank you, Susan, for the introduction, comes from the Middle East. But just this is an exceedingly difficult negotiation. I had the pleasure of participating in a class led by Bob Mnookin, my colleague, around this question of North Korea and looking at all the barriers to this negotiation. It's hugely complex. It's hugely complex. So the subject of difficult negotiation reminds me of this story, which comes, incidentally, from the Middle East, which is a story of a man who dies and leaves to his 3 sons 17 camels. And there's no way to divide them up because he leaves half the camels to one son, the oldest son, a third of the camels to the second son, and a ninth of the camels to the third son. And 17 doesn't happen to divide by 2 or by 3 or by 9. So the 3 sons get into a big quarrel. It almost turns into fraternal strife. And then finally, in desperation, they go and they consult a wise old person. And this person gives them some advice and says, well, I don't know if I can help you. Really, I don't know if I can help you. They're a third party in the situation, but at least you can have my camel. So the 3 sons take their camels. They have 18 camels. 18 happens to divide by 2. That's 9. The second son takes his third. A third of 18 is 6. 18 does divide by 9. You get 2, you've had 9 and 6 and 2, you get 17. They have 1 camel left over. They give it back to the wise old person. Now, that reminds me a lot of the difficult negotiations that we face, including this one with North Korea, in the sense that on the face of it, there doesn't seem to be a solution. Somehow what we need to do is take a step back from the situation, like that wise person, go to the balcony, in other words, get some perspective on the situation and see if we can come up with an 18th camel. And that's the challenge I'd like to put to us this afternoon on this question of North Korea. I'd like to just begin, if I may, by asking you, as a way to write down 3 words here. I'm going to give you 3 questions, and I'd like you to put down 1 word to each question. I say it's just 2 words and 1 number. First question I'd like to ask you is, what's the first word that comes to your mind when you think of North Korea? What's the first word that comes to your mind? What's your first association? You hear the word North Korea. What's your first association? If you wouldn't mind putting down that 1 word. The second word I'd like you to put down is, when you think of this conflict, this crisis, the Korean nuclear crisis, what's the first word that occurs to you? How would you characterize that crisis? What's the word that, it may be an adjective, it may be a noun. What's the word? And then the third thing I'd like you to put down as a number, which is just from what you know, from what you've heard, what do you think the risk is of war between the United States and North Korea? Just a percentage. What would you say it was? Just again, a wild guess. What's your sense of that? Okay?
What is the chance of war?
What's the chance of war between the United States and North Korea?
Over what period?
So let's say over this year, 2018. Please come on in and have some seats. Yeah, please. There's plenty of seats. So, okay, so let's just take that just as again, the Korea Negotiation Initiative, which is based at the Harvard Negotiation Project, and the academic sponsor is Jim Sebenius, who's here. And it is a fledgling initiative. It's a collaborative inquiry into the barriers to a negotiated resolution of the crisis and how to overcome them. And so just in this collaborative inquiry here, I just want to ask you those questions. So when I asked you the question, what's the word that comes to mind when you think of North Korea? If you don't mind just sharing, what words came to your mind? Desperate. What was that? Isolated. Miserable. Communism. Difficult. Misunderstood. Oppressive. Rogue. What was that? Deceptive. Hostile. Unpredictable. Nuclear. Okay. That just gives us a kind of, any others? What was that? Secrecy. Closed. Yeah. So you get a kind of sense of the images that we have of this country. And then I asked you for a word about the conflict itself. What was the word that came to mind for you around that? What was that? Existential.
Intense.
Intense. Complex.
Never-ending.
Never-ending.
Intractable.
Intractable. What was that? Prolonged, right.
Dangerous.
Dangerous. Fear. Okay. It gives us another kind of like sense of, because I think so much of this conflict, the reason why I think it's so important to kind of look at these things is so much of this conflict has a psychological dimension that we don't often talk about. But there's a deep psychological dimension to this conflict that I think if we don't understand, it's going to be hard to actually find a way to resolve it. And the third thing was I asked you, what's your perception of risk? How many of you, what would you come up with, risk? 1%. Okay, how many of you came up with, let's say, less than 5%? Less than 5%. What other numbers did people come up with? 40%. 50%. 20%. What? 40%. 40 as well. Okay. Did anyone go over 50%, just out of curiosity? Oh, Muli? 60%. Okay, so how many of you came up with a number that, say, it was less than 10%? How about between 10 and 20%? How about between 20 and 30%? How about between 30 and 40%? Okay, how about above 40%? Okay, so you can see it's a whole play. No one actually knows, but it's interesting that, I mean, what got me, I'm not a North Korea specialist. I think you really have to study this. I mean, I had breakfast this morning with a North Korea specialist who spent 20 years just obsessed with this one. That's a North Korea specialist. But my job is consulting North Korea specialists to try and understand, is there a way out? And the reason why I got animated about this question about a year ago was when I was reading, you know, I've been following North Korea from afar as someone who's interested. I was, you know, I've had a long-standing interest in back to the 80s and how to reduce the risk of nuclear war. And at the end of this, spent about 10 years working on that. But at the end of the Cold War, I went off and worked on other conflicts like Colombia and so on. But about a year ago, I suddenly woke up and realized that, in fact, there were serious experts like former Secretary of Defense William Perry, who was at the end of his a very, very distinguished career, who was saying, you know, the risk of war, of nuclear war, at this moment is as high, if not higher, than at any point during the Cold War. And that's from someone who's, I know, is just extremely rational, bright, brilliant man who's seen a lot. He was involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis, seen a lot. He was involved in North Korea. And so when he's saying that, you wake up and you say, what's actually going on here? And he was, you know, if you look at the sources, the existential sources of threat in the world today of a nuclear conflict, you know, there's the US-Russian relationship, which is deteriorating. There is India-Pakistan, which is also highly unstable. There's the risk of nuclear terrorism. But perhaps the single greatest risk right now, at this particular moment, for a wide range of experts, is this particular crisis, is the crisis with North Korea. And people from the right of the spectrum to the left of the spectrum. I was kind of struck when I had a conversation with the leading American diplomat for one of the attempts, for one of the actually successful agreements, the agreed framework. And I asked him, Bob Gallucci, I asked him what the risk of war was, and he said, what are the chances of peace? You tell me, you give me a scenario by which we avoid war. Because essentially you have a situation where both sides have drawn lines in the sand. Both sides are playing a game of what our colleague, old colleague from the program on negotiation in its early years, Tom Schelling, would call, you know, a game of chicken. Both sides are playing chicken, a game of nuclear chicken. It's like two cars headed straight to each other, and the question is, where's the off-ramp? Where is the off-ramp here? Because what the United States has done, President Trump has said, is this will not happen. North Korea will not have the capacity to attack the American mainland, will not have the capacity to land a missile right here in Boston or Washington. And throughout the course of the last year, you saw, in fact, North Korea developing that capacity. So that's the question that I'm sitting with all of you, which is how do we begin to find a way out of this? That's the question. How do we find a way out? And I just want to begin, if you will, by a word about the Korean War, because I think, at least for, I know that we have a very international crowd here, but at least I think for the world, basically, the Korean War is like it's somehow lost in the mists of memory. We remember World War II. We remember Vietnam. But we have a sort of a vague memory for the great majority of us of the Korean War. It's in many ways, it's the forgotten war. It's the forgotten war. And it's like, and I think most Americans, and I think most people in the world don't even realize that that war never ended. This is the longest running war in American history, 70 years. It ended with an armistice, but it is still technically, the United States is still technically in a state of war with North Korea. And it's a little bit, it reminds me a little bit of a kind of like a wound on your arm. You know, if you imagine humanity as a body for a moment, and there's a wound on the arm, and you know, an armistice kind of puts a bandage on it. But now we wake up, you know, 70 years later, and that wound is turned gangrenous, and it's actually capable of threatening in an existential way the entire body. I'm not saying that war will end, but I'm saying there's an existential threat that didn't exist there before, and it's hard for us to come to terms with. It's hard for us to remember, and when we talk about it, there's a lot of talk about the current situation, but we don't have a lot of knowledge or a kind of a deep understanding of the roots of that war, or of what were the roots of this current conflict. Because we don't have that sense of history, but in this particular war, the devastation was enormous. Over 2.5 million people lost their lives. It's a little hard to even digest that figure, but there were 36,000 American dead. There were over 100,000 American wounded. That's just for the U.S. There were over 600,000 Chinese casualties, and there were 1,200,000 South Korean and 1 million North Korean casualties. I mean, it's just worth for a moment. Even I'm just going to pause here for just 5 seconds, just a second of silence, just to digest what kind of devastation you could imagine happened on that small little peninsula where, as I'll just read you Curtis LeMay. Let's see if I have it here. Curtis LeMay, I think it was like 20% of the population basically was killed. There was not a single town left that was standing. It had come to the place where the United States had run out of bombing targets. There were no more bombing targets. So it was completely leveled, North Korea. So just want to take a moment, just 5 seconds of silence, just to digest what 2.5 million people dying means. Just for a second here, because it's like there's just going to take 3 seconds of silence. So it causes a trauma, a collective psychological, emotional trauma. And we all know from individual trauma psychology, from collective trauma psychology, just that traumas have a way, if you don't heal them, they have a way of repeating themselves. So in some ways, what's happening today is a repetition of a collective trauma. And if we don't understand that and inform that, it's going to be very hard to deal even with the current crisis today. Because the image that we often have of North Korea is it's kind of crazy. It's, as you mentioned, it's kind of like, it's seen as kind of the oddball. But that may be a trauma response. I mean, right now, if even it just to zoom right to this second, if you read the North Korean language, for example, their policy, even their policy about the latest summit, it's if the United States drops its hostile policy, we are willing to consider denuclearization. What does hostile policy mean? I mean, we can go into things, but no one, I've talked to many experts, and everyone has a different opinion of what hostile policy means. But in the end, if you root it in an understanding of trauma, hostile policy means it's the feeling, real or not, that the government of North Korea, the people of North Korea for that matter, because they've kept, I mean, for us in the United States, that conflict is forgotten. But for them, it's so alive right now. That's what we're dealing with, is the hostile policy means the constant threat or the constant fear that at any moment you might be annihilated, which is what happened before in 1950s, which for us is ancient history, but for them is today, and it's a trauma that's continually reactivated in the curriculum, in the museums, in the culture. So that's the kind of phenomenon we're dealing with. Just saying, okay, how do you deactivate that? It's like a bomb, a ticking time bomb. So how do you deactivate that so that we can have a chance to actually avert a situation which could tip into war? So there have been many attempts to resolve the conflict, and I won't go into them. But there have been many attempts. There have been at least 3 major attempts. There was an agreed framework, as many of you know, negotiated under President Clinton during the 90s. There was, which actually led to the one agreement that, at least for a little bit, seemed to be working, or seemed to be headed. There was an attempt made under the Bush administration with the 6-party peace talks, involving many of the neighbors involved in that conflict, and which did not lead to an agreement, but at least made substantial progress. And then there was a brief moment during the Obama administration when there was a Leap Day agreement in 2012, which lasted barely a month. And so there's a history here of some attempts, some close calls, some. This was Madeleine Albright met with Kim Jong-il, and they came close. There were moments when it seemed close, and it kind of receded. And just to bring us to the current crisis right now, in the last year, as you can see, despite President Trump drawing a red line saying this will not happen, maybe last February, the government of North Korea proceeded to test one missile after another, which, if you look at it, kept on coming closer and closer, so that in July, for example, the July 4th test was already starting to reach the North American mainland. By July 28th, the test was estimated to reach the western part of the United States, and the last test on November 29th reaches the entire. So there's some question about can they miniaturize nuclear weapons? Do they have reentry capability and so on? But there was the intelligence estimates. When I began to really focus on this, was about a year ago, the intelligence estimates at that point were about 3, 4, or 5 years for North Korea to attain this capacity. And within months, they were there, which was a huge surprise to even the best intelligence estimate, in the community. And so the question is, there's a lot that we don't know. As was mentioned in the images. Please come on in and take seats if you like. Please, if you like, there's plenty of seats. Please feel free. And there's a lot that we don't know. So that brings us up to the current crisis. And with an unacceptably, I don't know what the risk of nuclear war is. I don't know if it's 1% or if it's 5% or if it's 50%. But I have good colleagues who are very close to the situation, like, well, take Richard Haas, for example, who's the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, Harvard. He's on record as saying he thinks that it's 50. It's could be somewhere in the odds of 50%. And I know him. He's not someone to put a loose number on it. Or you have a former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, in congressional testimony saying it could be 25%. People are coming up, even if it's 5%. If you look at the consequences, why there's kind of variation on what the risk factor is, there isn't a lot of dissension about what the consequences would be. And the consequences of war would be with thousands of even conventional artillery over Seoul. I mean, Seoul basically is a city of 10 to, the metropolitan area has about maybe 25 million people. And you have over 10,000 long-range artillery, such that the estimates are that within hours, you could have several 100,000 dead. Just within hours, just from a conventional attack. Then if you factor in the fact that they have nuclear weapons, they could certainly reach Japan and South Korea. Estimates from people like my old colleague Scott Sagan are that you could have 1 million people die in a single day. You could have the estimates I've seen, again, and these are just estimates, who knows, are you could easily see 4 or 5 million people die. You could have nuclear weapons go off. You could have irradiation. You can imagine what the effect on the global economy would be of such a war. There's the possibility that if there is a war, of course, the United States will try to push into North Korea with South Korea, of course, to try to secure the nuclear weapons. China could do the same. There's China has a defense treaty with North Korea, and they've recently signaled that they will not enter the war if North Korea attacks the United States or the South, but they will come to the defense of North Korea if the United States attacks first. So you have the possibility, which is almost unimaginable, of a war that would be the single biggest event on this planet since World War II. And so the consequences are whether it's 1% or 5% or 10%, if you just take the percentage times the consequences, it really means that we ought to pay every attention to this conflict. We should try to find every possible way of averting a consequence that would be as catastrophic and as consequential to basically everyone on the planet, I think. I don't think there would be one country or one place on the planet that wouldn't be affected by this, either by radiation, either by economic, but just in this kind of interdependent world. So that's, the more I looked into it and talked to very sober-minded experts, the more concerned I became, which is why for me, this is like, this is a question I think we're facing in effect. Somehow somehow I notice in the media and our public mind, it just seems so unthinkable that we kind of push it out of our minds. But we're looking at the possibility of a nuclear holocaust. I mean, certainly the number of casualties are the size of what was the Holocaust, what was the original Holocaust, and the possibility of nuclear weapons, such that there was a set of war games that were done by the Pacific Command, which would direct the American response in Honolulu about a month ago. And the general who participated in these war games, or this is kind of a simulation, and he said, the level of brutality of this war, if it happens, will exceed the experience of any living soldier. So that's the danger, and that's why I think those of us, for example, engaged in the negotiation community ought to be thinking hard, where is the way out? Because as we can look at it, the barriers are large. One thing that happened in the way in which history unfolds, you just don't know these synchronicities, but just at the peak, that last test was at the end of November, and suddenly, in February, the Olympics took place. I mean, I don't know what the odds are, if you were a playwright scripting this out, that on the most militarized place on the planet, at the time of highest perceived risk, that suddenly the Olympics would happen on that peninsula within a few dozen miles of the border at that particular point, if you were writing this as a novel. But the Olympics did happen, and the Olympics provided a pause. It was a time on the balcony. It was a pause, just a pause, but it opened up a possibility. And it opened up a possibility such that there's now the possibility of summits. We just saw a summit happen 2 weeks ago where a surprise summit between Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping. And in 2 weeks, there will be a summit between Kim and President Moon, which will be the first time that a member of the Kim dynasty has stepped foot in South Korea. Technically, he'll be on the South Korean side of that border. And then there is every expectation, as President Trump announced again today, that there will be a summit between him and Kim Jong-un sometime either in late May or early June. So there are these possibilities now. There's a series of summits that could be. There's even talk of a summit between President Abe of Japan and Kim, and who knows, it may be a trilateral summit, a quadrilateral summit. So we're seeing a kind of choreography of possible summits. The question is, what's the potential of those summits? And that's where we come to, what are the barriers to getting to yes? And I'd like to just actually ask you to think through with me, since it's a collaborative inquiry, what are some of the barriers here? Let's just start with the psychological barriers. If you wouldn't just mind just tossing out, what do you think some of the psychological barriers here are to actually imagining that the United States and North Korea, together with South Korea, together with China, et cetera, and so on, can actually reach an agreement of some kind that would avert a war? What do you see as the psychological barriers?
Trust.
What's that? Trust, yeah. Deep. Preconceptions. Ego. What other barriers come to mind? A lot of hard positions, yeah.
Miscommunication.
A lot of miscommunication. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Both participants, both sides of the state are not secure in their power.
They're not secure. Yeah, there's insecurity.
Domestically.
Yeah, domestically, okay. Uh-huh. What else?
Fear.
Fear. Yes, please. Trust, yeah. So, trust is a big one. I mean, again, I'll just put up a few here that come to mind, but fear and distrust, certainly coming out of trauma. One thing that struck me early on was, everyone believes that, okay, the North Korean and the North Korean regime, their primary concern is regime safety, is security of that regime. How can either side trust the other here in this particular situation, given the trauma of that war in the beginning, and then given the fact that in the United States, at least, we have a perception, and it's particularly strong, very strong, in the government, that there's a perception based on reality that the North Koreans have cheated a lot. that they never kept their agreements. They actually have a similar perception of us, that we haven't always kept our agreements. As Professor Mnookin mentioned in the class, even in the very beginning, the armistice agreement basically had a clause that said that neither side should introduce new weaponry into the peninsula. That was in 1953. By 56, 57, the United States had decided to introduce nuclear weapons into the South. So that's remembered. It's also remembered that even with the agreed framework, that the United States did not fully fulfill its promise of delivering a light water reactor, heavy fuel, and so on. So there's on both sides, you see accusations of no trust. Just before, in the early 2000s, or in the in the early 2000s, American delegations to North Korea or talks would often say to the North Koreans, "Why don't you do what the Libyans did?" After all, because the Libyans surrendered their nuclear capacity, and they were having economic relations with the West and open minded. They would point to the Libyan example. About a month before Kim Jong-un took office, there was the televised spectacle of what happened to Gaddafi. That image, very much. So one of the questions is, whatever deal is made, how could either side trust the other? What's happening now with the Iran deal, for example, if the United States decides to withdraw, as is widely expected from the Iran deal, how can then other players actually put credibility in the word of an American president, in a treaty, in a commitment? So that's trust is a huge issue. There are many misperceptions, of course. And one thing I would say, too, is that I've found is there's a certain overconfidence, which is, in other words, each side is confident, maybe overconfident, that they can, and which is what happens in a game of chicken, is each side is confident, and that kind of overconfidence can do it. What about in terms of substance? What are the barriers that you see in terms of substance? What's in the way? Excuse me?
Money.
Money.
So it's very hard to verify North Koreans are leading on the question. How we could find out if they agree, we have to verify it. So it's very
Yeah. How can they verify, give up their nuclear weapons? Yeah. I mean, one thing that I've found, again, is it would be hard for me to find a strategist who, if this was a game, putting themselves in the North Korean shoes, would say, you should give up your nuclear weapons. If for them, that's what they regard as their insurance policy. It's hard to find someone who could make that argument. So denuclearization, is a major issue. Even the term denuclearization, both sides have radically different definitions of it. For I think the North, denuclearization may be an ultimate kind of like possibility and no one knows whether they're serious about whether they mean it. But for them, it's a maybe a 15-year process. It's like salami. You just keep on moving small steps, and you get concessions in return for it. I think for the United States, the U.S. government right now, it's an express train. It's like tell us. I think John Bolton said this. He said, "Just tell us the name of the port. We'll show up with our ships. You load on the nuclear weapons, and we handle this in a few months." So the disparity in positions is huge substantively. There's a real question as to whether or not there is a ZOPA, a zone of possible agreement. When I've asked American government officials, do they see a ZOPA? They don't. It's like, so it's a very big barrier to a possible agreement. The those are some of the substantive things. There's some question of whether or not there's a herding stalemate, whether or not actually either side is hurting enough that there's actually a motivation to reach agreement. And then there's process. What do you see in terms of process barriers? You mentioned, yeah.
Trump is so volatile.
Yeah.
Things change day to day. Even his own assistants don't know if
Yeah.
it's true or not.
Yeah.
What he declares.
Yeah.
And the Chinese and the North Koreans have already concluded that. So has Europe.
Right. So there's a kind of a volatility. There's a changeability. Both sides actually subscribe to, both leaders, I would say, subscribe to the kind of madman theory of negotiation, of kind of the value of being unpredictable. Actually, it's not just a characteristic, it's actually a strategy, perhaps, of being unpredictable. What other barriers do you see in terms of process? Yes?
This is a question.
Sure.
Back in the 80s, when the U.S. and the Soviet Union had this building arms race, there was a strategy called mutually assured destruction.
Right.
That we couldn't have first use of nuclear weapons because everyone would succumb. And I'm wondering if this strategy, it seems as though we've forgotten that
Yeah.
nuclear weapons has a mutually assured destruction
Yeah.
attached to it. And I think that's either a process, that
Mhm.
was a strategy,
Mm-hmm.
and it no longer seems to be a strategy.
Right. Right.
So is that a process situation, or is it substance, or is it psychology, or is it all?
Yeah, or maybe there's another category there which has to do with it has to do with, and we'll talk about this in a moment, but it has to do with power, obviously, and
Rationality.
yeah, what provides the incentive to reach an agreement? We'll come to that in a moment. Yes, please.
There's a problem with the venue of where to actually meet because there can be
Yeah. Sure. Okay. Good. Yes, a couple more. Yeah. Please.
They're starting at the top.
Mm-hmm.
They're starting with
Sure.
the big decision makers.
Yeah.
And I don't know what's below. I mean,
Yeah.
it's kind of weird.
Yep.
I will say that there is no like an international mediator or someone external
Right.
that will listen to both parties,
Mm-hmm.
what they're after.
Yeah.
As it came out, for example, in the case of the Pope in negotiations between the United States and Cuba. So there's missing someone that can understand both parties.
For sure. There's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of communication barriers which could be facilitated. I mean, these are just a few of them. There's there's a lot of parties involved, as we'll talk about in a moment here. There's very different perception around time and the time that in which this can be resolved. And there's a lot of internal decision making, at least on the part of, there's real questioning about whether both with domestic constituencies, at least in the United States, but also just in terms of the sheer capacity of the US government at this point, having just shifted its Secretary of State, having just shifted its National Security Advisor, just shifted today, does the United States have the capacity to manage a very complex negotiation? Does it have the capacity to do that right now, given a summit coming up? So you can see there are many, many, many different barriers. I just want to now we talk, okay, how do we overcome these barriers? How do we begin to do it? Again, just a very brief way of sort of thinking this through, but with you. But for me, it all starts with our ability to go to the balcony, which is just simply a place to me to kind of take in the big picture. It's a place of perspective, to kind of pull back from the situation. We want to talk about power and BATNA, which is the alternative, and then where's the bridge here? And I'm going to move a little bit fast here so I can really get to questions and so on. But essentially, in terms of balcony, begins, of course, by identifying all the different parties. And there are many different parties in this. I'm talking about North Korea and the United States, but of course, China is a huge player in this, a huge player. It's by far and away the largest trading partner of North Korea, like 85% of its imports and exports. Russia's a huge player in this. Japan, of course, South Korea, and there are many, many different parties in this situation. But just from a balcony point of view, you want to look and see what can different players do. Because if we're looking for an 18th camel, we need to think not just about what the North and the United States can do, but what the other players can do in the situation. Speaking of mediation, for example, what seems to be shaping up is that President Moon of South Korea is playing a little bit of a mediating role. And in fact, the summit that's coming up, in a sense, they mediated the summit between the North and the United States. And their summit, I think, while they're very interested, why President Moon's very interested in advancing inter-Korean relationships, he realizes, because of the larger situation, that the only way he can really advance inter-Korean relationships is by bringing the United States and North Korea into some kind of understanding, particularly around the very complicated and seemingly intractable issue of denuclearization. So there are many different parties, but just to look at interests from, to focus what's the prize here for North Korea and for the United States. Let's just start with North Korea for a moment. What do you think the prime concerns, interests of North Korea are? And in particular, I'd focus on the North Korean regime headed up by Kim Jong-un. What do you think's foremost on his mind? Yes, please.
Regime survival.
Regime survival. Yeah. That seems to be the universal consensus, is that's the big driver. What else is on his mind, do you think?
Diplomatic legitimacy.
Diplomatic legitimacy, some kind of recognition. Yes, please. Economic development. Okay. And those, yes, Dan.
Loyalty to his family heritage.
Loyalty to his family heritage. Yeah, personally, for sure. To his father, to his grandfather, to this whole dynasty is very important. And so if you just, again, no one knows this for sure, but just in rough sequence, it seems to be something like this. It seems to be regime survival, recognition. It seems to be a deep desire to be recognized of some kind. Political recognition, diplomatic recognition, recognized as a nuclear power state. But just even trying to understand that psychologically, it's been a very isolated, excluded country. There's a deep human desire for recognition of some kind. Economic development is key. And if you think about it, all of these tie back to regime survival. Economic development, unless Kim is able to provide some level of economic well-being, at least to the small percentage of the North Korean population on which power base his power resides, he may not be able to stay in power. So economic development is linked to regime survival, and so is, I believe, recognition. In some sense, I think there's some sense in which that desire for recognition, the desire for the end of the hostile policy, the desire is linked somehow to survival. That through recognition, there's some kind of perceived security. So all of them are kind of linked together. And then for the US, what would you say for the US? Yeah. Yeah, and again, obviously, this is you'd want to, in a complex negotiation analysis, it wouldn't just be the United States. You'd take a look at the president. You'd look at all the different power bases. In fact, with the parties, you would look at all the different interest groups and so on in the United States to try truly parse this out. The one thing that makes this a little bit easier if more perilous for the world, is that in terms of war itself, the amount of concentration of power in two individuals to affect this is kind of unprecedented. I mean, essentially, the truth is that President Trump could decide to go to war, and not Congress, not his Secretary of Defense. I mean, he has the ability to decide. So in that mind, in the mind of our president, there is that power to lead us into war, whether or not any other major factor. And the same thing seems to be very much true on the North Korean side. So to me, looking at it from a negotiation point of view, from the beginning, the question was, if we're going to find a way out, there has to be these two individuals have to feel, each of them, like they're a hero, like they won, like that. Just trying to understand their psychologies, there has to be. I like to start back, and I'll come to that in a moment. I like to often, in a negotiation thing, is to start from and work backwards. And the thing I like to work backwards is just to do a kind of a thought experiment, is to imagine that you do have a deal. And not just a deal, but a deal that obviously could be implemented. But let's imagine you do have a deal. What are the two twin victory speeches? What's the victory speech that President Trump delivers, in which he says, I won? And what's the victory speech that Kim Jong-un can deliver that says, I won? And then think backwards to what is it that would be necessary to produce that result. So for the United States, in terms of things, as far as I can read, it's security of the U.S. homeland is number one, and it's now being put into jeopardy by the North Korean capacity or growing capacity to hit the American homeland. Security of allies and the whole regional alliance there. And then non-proliferation. There's a big fear that North Korea will continue, as it has in the past, to assist Iran. It has all kinds of relations with Iran, Syria, that they will export their nuclear and missile technology to the rest of the world. And I'm sure there are many others as well. But then we come to BATNA, which is, and again, I just want to go through this a little bit rapidly because I want to get to where is the deal here? Where's the possibility here? But just BATNA, what would you say the U.S. BATNA is in this case? War, right? And what? Status quo. Stalemate. Ratcheting up sanctions. Okay. What's that? Verify. Yeah, no, but there are BATNA. In other words, BATNA is what the United States could do irrespective, to advance its interests, irrespective of what the other side would, independent of what the other side would do. So there's various forms of maximum pressure which could be ratcheted up, which takes the form not just of sanctions. There's military pressure, there's diplomatic, there's political pressure, and so on. And there's war. And to me, one of the real questions for us is to imagine that if, in fact, negotiation is perceived to have failed or not to work by the American government, is there any plan B short of war? Is there anything that could meet the American interests, perceived interests, short of going to war if negotiation doesn't work? Yeah, Max?
Is there a comment earlier by Sam Keller? Referring to mutually
Paula.
Paula, referring to mutually assured destruction.
Yeah.
Why? I guess I would lean toward thinking the U.S.'s their best, rather than just an alternative, would be to focus on how we would have
Yeah,
So you end up
Sure.
a stalemate. They continue to develop their nuclear
Sure.
weapons, but they can't fire them because we make it more and more clear.
for sure. Deterrence, really. Yeah.
Deterrence to use, not deterrence to develop.
Right, right, exactly. And that's, that, for example, that is a, that point of view is held by a good portion, of the security community that would say, look, they ask the question, if the United States was able to deter Red China, if it was able to deter the Soviet Union, why couldn't it deter North Korea? And one of the challenges is, again, we have to deal with what's in people's minds, but in the circle, the decision-making circle about going to war that exists in the United States, in the decision-making circle, there's a strong skepticism about whether deterrence would actually work. I think it goes back to, one is that there's a distrust of the intentions of the other side. Does North Korea have purely defensive intentions, or is it intending to use its nuclear capacity to basically deter the United States from coming in while they try to, in some way, forcibly occupy South Korea, or some kind of coerced unification of the peninsula?
In the Soviet Union or China.
What's that?
Doesn't sound so different than Soviet Union or China.
Why?
Everyone sees their
Yeah,
own weapons
sure.
as defensive. And sort of if we make it more salient
Yeah.
that sort of one nuclear use
Mm-hmm.
would launch sort of
Yeah.
this amazing response, which
Sure.
doesn't seem that hard to do.
Yeah.
I'm missing sort of absent the belief
Yeah.
that either Trump or Bill is massively not well,
Yeah.
which is a problem.
Yeah.
Why isn't that? I can't imagine the probabilities that we're in the room of 20, 40,
Sure.
50%,
Right.
given the viability of.
Right. So, yeah, and the thing is, you have a very rational way of viewing this, right? But what I'm talking about, I'm not saying that what's going on anywhere else is irrational. I'm just saying that we have to deal with the thinking and the arguments of people who are in the decision-making circle in Washington. And there is a very strong argument that carries weight, as far as I can tell, that deterrence may not work. You heard it, we've heard it expressed at different times, but it's also, the other thing about deterrence is that in the case of the Soviet Union and China, you were deterring a state. In this case, the argument's made, are you deterring an individual?
Well, there were times in the Soviet Union where the leader had that kind of power.
Well,
Stalin had that.
yeah, exactly. Well, listen, believe me, I'm just telling, I'm not going to take the side of the argument. I'm just saying that what we're facing, that you have to face, is skepticism very strongly about, A, what the intention of the other side is, and there's also skepticism about, questions were raised, is Kim, given the behavior of the last year, he's just pushing past one red line another. If you don't stop, basically, I'm just giving you some of the arguments that I hear, which is, if you don't stop him now, where's he going to go next?
It just seems like the viability of doing something was a lot better 20 years ago than it was now.
For sure.
And because we were afraid of the 30,000 conventional missiles aimed at South Korea, we couldn't adapt. So I'm missing the scenarios of how people think that we can act now where we could adapt.
We could, yeah.
I'm missing the logic of
Yeah,
the
yeah.
House in Washington
Yeah. Well, let me try, because this is something I think we need to do, is you need to understand what, you imagine a conversation around in the Situation Room or in the Oval Office where you have a half dozen or more individuals who are trying to decide if negotiation doesn't work, are we going to go to war? What are the dominant arguments that are being made? One, I would argue, that I'm hearing is negotiation won't work. They've always cheated. One is deterrence might not work. So that's the one we're talking about. One is that I think the president hears is, are you going to let this happen on your watch? In other words, and this is kind of an emotional argument of, like, to also political to your domestic base. Are you going to allow a country, a leader, that is perceived in Bob's language as evil, right, have the capacity to target an American city? You can just think about the emotional resonance. It's like, consider the concern here in this country around terrorism, where the casualties might be a few dozen people. Imagine that the image is that, are we going to allow that to, so you can hear that argument. You can hear arguments that time is running out, that if we don't stop them now, so your 30-year argument, yes, let's learn that lesson. If you don't stop them now, it's going to be even worse in a year's time or 2 years' time. So, the combination of those arguments could tilt the conversation towards war. And the question then is, again, coming back to where's the 18th camel here, is where are the dominant counterarguments that could be heard? Like, for example, there is a way out. There is a ZOPA. There is, sanctions could work. For example.
But you don't want the argument deterrence will work.
You don't what?
You see,
yeah.
the counter-argument that Max is offering
yeah.
is deterrence
will work.
Will work.
Sure.
It can work.
Yeah.
But Kim has
yeah.
not displayed the
yeah.
kind of craziness
sure.
that suggests he's suicidal. What's different about terrorists
sure.
is many of the terrorists
sure.
have got to be willing
sure.
to die.
Sure.
In which case they can impose enormous asymmetry.
Sure. I understand.
This is a regime
yeah.
where obviously if Kim is willing to sacrifice his regime,
sure.
it would be terrible.
Sure. You have an absolutely valid argument. All I'm saying is that the fact is, as negotiators, we had to deal with people's perceptions as they are. And all I'm saying is that there is a rational argument to be made, that's being made, that we may not agree with, that we may think the preponderance of evidence is against, that there's a questioning of whether or not deterrence will not work, which is then increases the danger, of course, because if deterrence won't work, then you might tilt towards a decision for war. Let me, so, for North Korea, their BATNA might be nuclear deterrence, undermining sanctions. I want to move us now to what's the bridge here? What's the way out? Where is that 18th camel? Where is this off-ramp? Because the barriers are huge, as we've just seen. It's not easy to answer these arguments. So to me, as best I can figure it out, there's an essence of a deal to be made here. And I'm not saying it's easy, but it's something around, it's a trade of denuking for peace in some ways. And peace has at least 3 possible pillars. It has a security pillar, it has an economic pillar, and it has a recognition pillar. That there needs to be something like that. Under security, we could, oh, wait, let me just go back. So under security, there's a challenge to be made, which is North Korea needs to be offered some security guarantee that cannot just depend on the U.S. word, right? It needs some kind of security guarantee. It needs to feel that the hostile policy has come to an end. It needs, one of the challenges of the negotiation is where's the credibility of the offer that the United States can make there, and what other countries can participate to make it credible. What could China do? What could Russia do? What could South Korea do? What could other countries, what could Europe do? In other words, how are they going to feel secure enough to be able to give up their nuclear and missile capacities, or at least to freeze them and begin to give them up? There's the whole question of economics. That is a major interest of North Korea. What are the possibilities there? Are there, for example, if you look at what happened with Vietnam, which was an American adversary, and now there was a process of economic normalization, trade, sanctions were lifted, and so on. What are the possibilities here for prosperity? I mean, one of the things just to look at exactly is what would it mean? What would it mean even to look and see if there were no war? If the war came to an end between, if the war came to an end in Korea, what would be the economic benefits? Right now, we just see this as a problem, but what would be the upside? I mean, the fact, for example, that Japan is, I think, 93% dependent on Middle Eastern oil, which is extremely, obviously, uncertain and unstable. If Russia has oil, there's a relatively short pipeline to be run from Russia to Japan that's being blocked by this conflict. South Korea exports huge amount to Europe, and it has to do it through a long, long shipping trade route. If there were no conflict, there would be an easy rail link through the Korean Peninsula, through Russia, that would go all the way to Europe. I mean, you think about trade in the Yellow Sea. You think about the natural resources in North Korea. Like, for example, everything that we have, all of our computers and smartphones, rely on elements of rare earth materials, REEs. Right now, China has a virtual monopoly on rare earth minerals. They have like 80% of the world's supply, and they're buying up all the rest of it around the world. They have a lock on it. Turns out North Korea has 6 times the amount of rare earth materials as China does. It's all buried into the ground. So in other words, there's natural resources. There's tourism possibilities. I mean, there's unspoiled beaches. There's, I mean, in other words, there's if you look at the South Korean miracle, the same culture, that hardworking culture exists in the North of the economic possibilities that could be unleashed if, in fact, there were peace. And then, of course, they want recognition. There's a deep need for recognition. So there's a possibility of diplomatic relations, what happened with the Olympics many times over, invitations, and so on. So the question for me is, as I think about what could happen at a summit, given the difficulties, given all the barriers we just identified, and a summit, of course, is very chancy in the sense of it's, as you mentioned, it's just like 2 leaders at the top. If they make a mistake, there isn't much recourse. But it also has the opportunity, particularly in dealing with North Korea, that all past negotiations have taken place at a working level, and they tend to go glacially slowly. At the top, when you're dealing with the person at the top, there's more flexibility and there's more rapidity that's possible, and it's never been tried before. So there's the possibility that you could have a major switch, which leads me in terms of an 18 Camel. If I think about how do you begin to reconcile where the US is and where North Korea is before we've taken a kind of step-by-step process. You go one step at a time. In this case, I don't see how that bridges the possible gap. Here, to me, I think you need to go with a very comprehensive approach, like have a framework agreement that basically encapsulates the essential deal, that has the whole deal there. It's a kind of a package deal in the beginning that then gets implemented over time. I think you need to think about, we need to think about, obviously verification came up. So it needs to be as, basically as actions are taken, there's synchronized actions on the other side. It can't rely on people's words. It has to be as independent of trust as possible, given the deep distrust between the parties. I think it needs to, I think actually, as I think about it and trying to just historically and looking at it, I think, how do we make, how do you make the presidents, or the leaders in this case, how do you give them the capacity to give victory speeches? To me, one thing to look at, and I grant you, it would be very difficult to imagine, but is a transformation in the relationship, an attitudinal restructuring of the relationship, like when Nixon went to China, like when Reagan met with Gorbachev, like when Sadat went to Jerusalem. In other words, something that in very short period of time can begin to restructure the perceptions that each side has. And the reason I say that is denuclearization is going to take some time. It's going to be painful. And unless there's a larger psychological shift in the relationship at the same time that gives political benefits to both sides, to the leaders of both sides, I find it hard to reach an agreement. So is it difficult? Yes. But this is what, I imagine, economically, there could be prosperity. Culturally, you could see a lot of things happen. Politically, you could see a lot of things happen. Is it possible? I mean, is it possible to imagine a rather dramatic transformation in the relationship? Very difficult, very hard to imagine. But also remember how hard it was to imagine at other points, in all of those situations. China, it never seemed like there was a possibility of doing it with China. It never seemed like it was possible to do it with the Soviet Union. It never seemed like it was possible between Israel and Egypt. Is this a moment when things could be fundamentally realigned because you have two leaders who are both volatile, who are both willing to think outside of the box? It creates huge dangers, but is there also an opportunity there to actually, for a long time, the North Koreans have been intimating to American diplomats over the years, hey, don't you guys get it? We'd like to pivot away from China towards you. We're too dependent on China. Is it possible that a pivot like that could take place? Is it possible that you could imagine an alliance of some kind between the United States and North Korea? I mean, it seems almost unimaginable, but is that possible? Is there some way to realign the situation that allows then, that subsumes the question of denuclearization in some ways in a larger perceptual relational change? I don't know if it's possible. I have no idea whether it's possible. I admit it's extremely difficult, but it's the one thing I keep on coming back to is that because we need to think out, because if you look at it just rationally, you look at all the barriers, you look at all the problems, it seems like we're on this, as one expert put it to me in my conversation this morning. He said, look, there's like a bomb ticking. It's like those bomb ticking. It's just ticking, and it's going to go off at some point. And is there some way of diffusing that bomb? So so back to the victory speeches here. Donald Trump needs to be able to say something like, "I've made America safe again. This is the deal of the century. I did what Obama couldn't do, I did what Bush couldn't do, I did what Clinton couldn't do, and it won't cost us a penny. Because the Chinese will pay for it, the South Koreans will pay for it, everyone else will pay for it. Kim needs to be able to say, you know, our country is safe, our economy will grow and prosper, we have the respect, we finally have the respect we deserve, you know, and I completed, this goes back to Dan's point, I completed my father and grandfather's dreams, I was loyal to their heritage. I mean, one of the things we have going for us is that both his grandfather and his father blessed, in fact, even as his dying wish, the idea of denuclearization of the peninsula. So it's kind of ingrained there. Can we? So it's something like that. And sometimes just as a way of kind of imagining the impossible here, I like to use Photoshop. So here's the possibility before the end of the year is a trilateral summit between the three of them in which they announce and make a declaration that the era of war, the state of war that's existed for 70 years is at an end, and that they're directing their respective diplomats to work hard at it for as long as it takes to make sure that it gets implemented. But essentially, a Nobel Prize winning moment, one of those iconic photographs where all three of them can come together, make a big declaratory statement that would allow them to make those victory speeches, and then let the hard, long process of actually implementing this in a verifiable hard work start to happen. At least that's my call it my pipe dream, but that's my if I had a magic wand, that's what I think we could work for, and I think it would, you know, within this year. So by the end of this year, we can come back and have this conversation. By the end of this year, you know, we'll know, did we go to war? Did it end up very, very kind of inconclusively in some way, or is a breakthrough possible? So I'll take questions. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah. Oh, please. I'm sorry. Please, right here. Yes, ma'am. And then I'll come to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. And I'd like
A microphone. Yeah, you just push the button here. Yeah. There you go.
hi.
You hold the button. There, I'll give it.
Sorry. I really like your idea of denuke for peace, but I wonder what is the concrete substance of this package of deal. For example, in order to reach the goal of security, what kind of article should be written in this deal? Because I guess that nothing will make North Korea more secure than the nuclear weapons. So how can this goal be achieved, actually? Thank you.
Well, you heard that question, right? So it's a very hard question of what kind of security guarantees could be offered North Korea in exchange for giving up its nuclear and missile capacity. And I think we've established that the United States' word alone may not be enough given the record. The question is, what can the U.S. do to convince North Korea that it's dropped its hostile policy? That's always been the explicit demand of the North, is to drop the hostile policy. That could take various forms, but to me, one of the attractive things about the possibility of transforming the relationship is transforming the relationship has in it dropping the hostile policy. Because it's like when I mean, right now, China has many more nuclear weapons than North Korea does, but the United States, we don't worry so much about the Chinese. The United States doesn't worry so much about the Chinese nuclear weapons and vice versa, because the relationship is basically different. And so, to me, that's one of the questions. How does the world, how is it's internationally guaranteed? It's not just the United States. There are various ideas I've seen even out there of having even, I don't know, international troops along the, peacekeeping troops along the border. There's the Chinese coming in and offering a kind of security guarantee. There's a lot of ideas out there, but that's one of the key questions to me, is how can North Korea how can they feel safe, basically? How do we solve that, of them feel safe? How do they feel that their number one interest of regime survival is actually secured? That's the question. Yeah, yes, sir, you had a question, yeah?
Well, actually, I see that as a quartet with China.
You what?
I see that as a quartet.
Yeah, a quartet, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. In fact, there's a whole choreography of summits here. But one possibility is there's a trilateral summit here, followed by a quadrilateral summit with China. And in fact, so one of the questions, actually a good negotiation question, is if you have a whole series of summits, how do you choreograph these summits so that they form what my colleague Jim Sabanius here calls a negotiation campaign, a whole series of things involving different players, different parties, and how can that play out? But absolutely, China needs to be is a very important player in that. Yes, Jim?
But just on this point of security, I think the real issue, you can imagine deals that are so much better than the alternatives. And the question is, can these leaders reach them, particularly if behaviorally they're very aggressive? The first rule in Donald Trump's book is push like crazy and keep pushing, right? And Kim is pretty scared and also pretty aggressive. And so the question is, can you back away from that? But you can imagine, North Korea, for Libya is one example, but also they saw that Saddam did not have nuclear weapons and what happened to him. And Ukraine gave up its, and how did Russia react there? So there's a sense that this is a security blanket that's really important. That, I think, goes to your over time piece, because actually denuclearization has been accepted as a principle for a long time by the North Koreans, though it could be trumpeted as a huge concession by us. But you can imagine keeping a small number of nuclear weapons for a while that serve as that sort of security blanket, in addition to whatever guarantees are there, and then if and as the relationship transforms, make that into a reality. But it's always an aspirational one. So you could see that kind of happening.
Sure.
And because then it is self-help, as well as relying on the words of others, and it's moving in the right direction. And if things change, well, then this nirvana that you described could come about.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, let's just have a bunch of questions because we don't have that much time. Yeah, please, sir.
So there was so much
Yeah.
you put on the table, and I appreciate it. So I don't know where to start. Number one, is it your belief that in their soul that Kim and Trump are rational actors? Which I think is very important to figuring out this potential success. My second question is, to what extent, and we talked about other countries, and we've talked very little about Russia, but if there's going to be a kumbaya moment between the United States, the two Koreas, and China, that's not necessarily going to be in Russia's interest. And a related question is, with the rhetoric and the tension in U.S.-China trade policy, and now the rhetoric between Trump and Putin with respect to Syria, how does all of that play into this?
For sure. I'm just going to take a couple more questions and then I'll answer them all at once. Yeah, please, in the back there, sir. Yeah, you've been waiting patiently.
Our last class that you went as far as to talk to Dennis Rothman
Right.
Who has spent significant amount of
Sure.
time with him.
Right.
I'm wondering if you could tell us any insights that
Sure.
you've learned about this.
Okay.
We all know so much about Trump.
Sure.
Can you tell us
Sure.
a bit about him?
Okay. Yeah, so let me, and it maybe goes back to this question about rationality and so on. I guess my view of rationality is, I mean, again, I have no way of looking into the soul of either Donald Trump or Kim Jong-un, but at least the way I approach it is they are rational in the sense that they have an internal logic. And in the internal logic may be to keep everyone off balance, but there's a logic there. There's a consistency of behavior. There is a, they're both, I think, I mean, in an interesting way, and this goes back to my conversation, 2 conversations with Dennis Rodman, was that there's a, well, here, let me go to, bring you to Dennis Rodman for a moment. But I do believe that we need to, I mean, are they rational in the sense they agree with us? No. But are they rational in the sense of, there's a way to their own behavior makes sense internally to them. In that sense, yes. There's a lot of emotion. And there's emotion in all of us, and Dan here will be the first to address that. But it's like, and there's, in particular case of from what I understand of our president, he doesn't quite know what he's going to do when he wakes up in the morning in terms of what decision he's going to make. He goes by his instincts. He goes by his gut a lot, and that's why a lot could be dependent. He's also, from what I understand, quite influenced by what he watches on TV that day. On Fox and Friends, but we have to understand, and I've tried to make a study, because I think in his mind actually is part of the key to this puzzle, which is why I come back to the victory speech. In terms of Kim, what I learned from Dennis Rodman is first of all, he considers Kim his friend. I mean, he will acknowledge, okay, I know I heard all this stuff about him and prison camps and everything like that, but he described in detail how he built a friendship with this man, in part through drinking. And drinking in that culture and in our culture, removes inhibitions, people can relate, and there was a way in which he connected. One way in which he said he connected was, the first time he met him, there was some kind of exhibition game for Vice Media TV or something that was over there, and he was sitting there watching the Harlem Globetrotters play, and suddenly Kim sat next to him, out of nowhere, and invited him to dinner, invited him to his home. He held Kim's baby. He described Kim's home, took him skiing. They spent quite a bit of time together. They drank a lot together. But one thing that Rodman said was he promised Kim that he would come back a few months after that for Kim's birthday, and he would bring some basketball players, and they'd play a game. And he did. Whether within a year, I don't know, it might have been only 6 months, he was back with some basketball players for his birthday, and Kim said, "You're the first person who's actually made a promise and kept it. You're my friend for life." One thing that Kim said to Rodman, which always stuck in my mind, is he said his dream one day was to walk down Fifth Avenue, go to Madison Square Garden, and watch a basketball game between the Knicks and the Bulls, sitting on the floor there with Dennis Rodman, and ideally Michael Jordan. And because he is a huge fan of the 94, 95, 96, whatever, that period of the Chicago Bulls history. And so one of the questions is, to me, is how do we make Kim's dream come true? And because, and that goes back to this transformation of the relationship that I'm talking about, is some way in which there's an attitudinal shift doesn't solve everything. I mean, for example, I've been looking at historical examples. When Khrushchev came to this country in 1959, it was huge. It shifted something. I mean, did it end the Cold War? By no means. The Cold War continued. We had the Cuban Missile Crisis within 3 years, but it shifted something. There was something that happened. And I'm wondering if, I mean, and this is very hard to believe it's back in Nirvana land, but imagine that at the summit between Kim and Trump, Trump invites Kim to come visit him at Mar-a-Lago for the next summit before the end of the year, in September, October, let's say, whatever it is. And Kim comes to this country. What would be the effect of that? You can imagine, I could imagine his security people sweating bullets, but what's the effect of going into the bosom of your adversary, your historic enemy? Is that even conceivable, given that, in fact, I mean, there's also, what would that do within North Korea? Because a lot of the North Korean power and hold is based on an enemy image of the United States. What does that mean? But it's just to explore that territory. But it goes back to that, I'll leave you with that image of Kim walking down Fifth Avenue going to a basketball game as a final image for this session. So thank you very much, appreciate it.